You're listening to the Telltale channel. Don't forget to check me out on all social media: Patreon, Twitter, Teespring, and Etsy. All links can be found in the description or on my website, telltaleatheist.com. Dominionism. You might be unfamiliar with the term, but it's basically a Christian political ideology that tries to intertwine Christianity into the political system. Like when Christian extremists try to ban adultery or try to force teachers to lead students in prayer. Prayer isn't banned in schools. It's never been banned in schools. What was banned was teachers leading students in prayer. But dominionists want to portray it as prayer being banned. Well, dominionists are now claiming that California's health restrictions are a sign of end times Christian persecution. Larry Tomczak, an advisor to Dominion legal organization called Liberty Counsel, said this on their podcast recently. Leftist politicians, media, celebrities, educators, and heretical religious leaders are all being manipulated by demonic forces to try to thwart advancement of the gospel of the kingdom at the close of the age. He said California's restrictions are a foreshadowing of what's coming the way of Christians in these end times prior to the return of Jesus Christ. His co-host, Che An, said God told him to have his church start meeting on Pentecost Sunday, May 31st this year, and to be strong and courageous like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, taking a stand against totalitarianism. I find it fascinating how these people are convinced the world is coming to an end, and that belief is leading to the destruction of society. Like believing something to be true makes it more true. It's called the illusory truth effect. They think civilizational destruction is close, so they do things to facilitate it. Like the idea that paper money has inherent value. The more people believe it, the more true it becomes. One person maintaining power is a sign of fascism. That's why the founding fathers in the U.S. wanted a system with terms instead of a monarchy. One clear sign a leader is pushing the country into fascism is when they refuse to give up leadership when their clock runs up. We saw it in Russia. Putin extended his term so he didn't have to leave office until 2036. Same with Erdogan in Turkey. He extended his until 2029. So when Trump proposed delaying the election, it should have been a clear red flag to everybody. But despite the red flag, a scary number of people still back him, even if they don't back that specific idea. Some of his biggest supporters, like Ted Cruz and Mitch McConnell, came out and said the election will take place as planned. We're not delaying it. But continued to assist in his efforts to attack the integrity of the election by talking shit about mail-in ballots, which is what troops, members of Congress, and presidents have used to vote for decades, even centuries. They want the guy in power, even when they realize he is one of the biggest threats to freedom we have ever seen. November 22nd, 1963. Lyndon B. Johnson takes over as president after the Kennedy assassination. One of his more famous acts as president was signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It wasn't very popular with the Democrat voters. It got Kennedy elected. The Democrat Party was the party that fought to keep slavery. Lincoln, a Republican, fought a war to end it. So when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, it pissed a lot of people off. 4 years later, in 1968, Nixon, a Republican, created something called the Southern Strategy. He wanted to bring all the old racist Democrats from the South into the Republican Party. The Southern Strategy was an electoral strategy to increase political support among white voters in the South by appealing to racism against African Americans. It worked. There was a complete political shift in the 1960s. The Republican Party used to be the party of civil rights back in the days of Lincoln, but Nixon started a movement, appeal to racism, exacerbate it. That's been the Republican Party strategy ever since. When Kennedy ran, people were concerned over the fact that he was Catholic. They were afraid his faith would influence his policy decisions. The Republican Party picked that up and ran with it too, in the 80s and the 90s. Now, faith is viewed as a virtue. If you show you're a Christian dominionist, then you can guarantee the evangelical vote. And Trump is now using the strategy to his advantage. He held an interview with a conservative Catholic TV network called EWTN. He said Democrats want to put the churches out of business and never want them to open. Just like the Southern Strategy adopted racism to appeal to voters, the Republican Party uses Christian nationalism to appeal to voters too. He said, you have some states. I think they never want them to open. They don't want churches to open. Look, the Democrats, frankly, if you look at the radical left, Democrats, which are the radical left now, they've gone radical left. Whether you're talking about life or whether you're talking about almost anything, they're not liking it. They're not liking it. The interview went on for a while and there was a lot more of the same thing, but it's one of the primary reasons why I will never vote Republican. I can honestly discuss the merits of tax cuts with people. I can honestly discuss the merits of traditional values, although I disagree with both. But the Republican Party today, after the intentional shift towards racism it saw in the 60s and the intentional shift it made toward religious extremism in the 80s and 90s, I I can't ever see myself supporting a Republican administration. Never say never, I guess. This week on the podcast, you guys probably know Jerry Falwell Sr. He lived from 1933 to 2007. He was a Southern Baptist pastor. He facilitated the creation of the evangelical voting bloc. He aimed to seamlessly intertwine politics and religion in the 80s and 90s. And he succeeded. Well, his son, Jerry Falwell Jr., is a mess right now. He's on the board of Liberty University, a famously Christian extremist school. Well, he was on the board. He was forced to resign recently. What the hell happened? Why'd he effectively get kicked off the board? Why are there a ton of pictures of him wearing an effeminate shirt and standing next to a strange woman with both their flies down? Where is his wife in these pictures? Some pictures of Falwell Jr. leaked recently, and he's dealing with some serious fallout. A recent survey shows most Americans oppose religious exemptions to COVID rules. But you wouldn't know it from how the country is reacting to churches having to move their services online. If you hear the Dominionists tell the story, they're being persecuted and attacked for their beliefs. That's the narrative they have to push, because movements gain momentum when there's a martyr. They want to show the world how hated and persecuted they are, and for no reason. Unfortunately for them, a new survey from Pew Research shows that pretty much the only people buying the persecution message they're pushing are fellow Dominionists. We're going to take a look at the new survey and see what we can learn from it. We all know Alex Jones is a nutbag. We've known it for years, but it's been getting progressively worse since he was kicked off public platforms. This is one of the downsides to centering freedom of expression. In this specific case, I actually agree with it. I think YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and the others did the right thing by kicking Alex Jones off the platforms. But it comes with consequences. If the companies allow their algorithms to boost their insane, dangerous rhetoric, it moves the Overton window of the user base, and thus the country, in that direction. If you have a bunch of YouTube channels and Twitter accounts talking about extreme right-wing ideas, like QAnon, for example, it normalizes the discussion. It makes it more credible, like people talking about getting microchipped when they're vaccinated. It's insane. But Facebook has allowed the discussion to take place in a big way, and now it's common sentiment. But the consequence to removing people like that from the platform is that they become more and more radicalized in their little bubbles, with nobody to push back against their crazy claims. They run into what I call level 1 or level 2 cults. Radicalized by the people around them to believe insane things. The more radical the idea, the higher your position in the organic hierarchy. Well, that's what happened to Alex Jones since he was removed from the public platforms. Now he's telling his listeners to get ready to die in a fight against the New World Order. He told his listeners to try to overcome their fear of death and be ready to kill as many of them as quickly as possible. Oh, in a defensive way, of course. He said this from behind the InfoWars desk, surrounded by military-style rifles. He said, "I want to avoid confrontation. I don't need to put that on my belt. I mean, I don't even want to kill these globalists. But if they want to kill us, the best thing to do is, in a defensive way, kill as many of them as quickly as possible." Again, the media will misquote that. I don't want to offensively kill anybody, but I'm not going to take this, okay? One of the problems with extremism is extremists tend to blur the definitions of words. What is violence? Well, when you think about it, saying certain words can tangibly hurt people, right? And that's violence. So in a roundabout way, if you think about it, insulting somebody is violence. You could even take it a step further. If you don't like somebody, even if you haven't acted on that dislike, it can play out in your behavior in the form of microaggressions. That could be considered violence, right? So you could say it's self-defense if you physically attack somebody who doesn't like you. Blurring the lines like this, or placing extreme or exaggerated importance on an event or idea, is a sign of extremism. And once you go down that road, it's not easy to find your way back.